Greetings everybody, GleeCon here again with another episode of Lore of Warcraft. On our last episode, we read the Chapter 1 of Lord of the Clans, which is seems to be so far a recollection of Thrall's life. We saw him as an infant, we saw his parents get murdered, something that we've talked about a couple times on previous episodes, but this was a more visceral, up close. I mean, we saw Durotan's arms get chopped off and the death of his wolf and all that stuff. So stay a while and listen to Chapter 2 of this novel, The Lord of the Clans. Temmus Foxton was in a state of high agitation, due directly and inevitably to the fact that his master was terribly displeased. Shouldn't it be her master? When they had brought the orc whelp home, Blackmore had been much as he was on the battlefield. Alert, interested, focused. The orcs were proving less and less of a challenge each day, and men used to the excitement of almost daily battles were growing bored. The planned bouts were proving extremely popular, giving men an outlet for their pent-up energies and providing a chance for a little money to change hands as well. And this orc was going to be raised firmly under human control. With the speed and power of the orcs, but the knowledge that Blackmore would impart, he would be all but unconquerable in the planned matches that were beginning to spring up. Except the ugly little thing wouldn't eat and had grown pale and quiet over the last several days. Nobody said the words, but everyone knew the beast was dying. That had enraged Blackmore. Once he had even seized the small monster and tried to shove finely chopped meat down its throat. He succeeded only in nearly choking the orc whom he had named Thrall, and when Thrall had spat up the meat, he had literally dropped the orc on the straw and strode cursing from the stable in which the orc was temporarily housed. Now Temmus walked around his master with the utmost discretion, choosing his words even more carefully than usual. Okay, so maybe Temmus is Taratha's dad? I don't know why I just assumed it was his mom. And yet more often than not, he had left an encounter with Lieutenant Blackmore with a bottle, sometimes empty, sometimes not, flying behind him. Yeah, okay. His wife Clania, a fair-haired, apple-cheeked woman who served in the kitchens, now set a plate of cold food in front of him on the wooden table and rubbed his tight neck as he sat down to eat. Compared to Blackmore, the beefy, loud cook who ran the kitchens was a veritable paladin. "Any word?" Claudia asked hopefully. She awkwardly sat down beside him at the rough wooden table. She had given birth a few weeks ago and still moved with hesitation. She and their eldest daughter, Taratha, had eaten many hours ago. Unseen by either parent, the girl, who slept with her baby brother in a small bed beside the hearth, had woken at her father's entrance. Now she sat up, her yellow curls covered by a sleeping cap, and watched and listened to the adult conversation. "Aye, and all bad," said Temmus heavily as he spooned congealing potato soup into his mouth. He chewed, swallowed, and continued, "The orc is dying. It won't take anything Blackmore tries to feed it." Claudia sighed and reached for her mending. The needle flashed back and forth, stitching together a new dress for Taratha. "It's only right," she said softly. "Blackmore has no business bringing something like that into Durnhold. Bad enough we've got the mature ones screaming all day long. I can't wait until the internment camps are finished and they're no longer Durnhold's problems." She shuddered. Taratha watched silent. Her eyes were wide. She had heard vague mutterings about a baby orc, but this was the first chance she had had to hear her parents discussing it. Her young mind raced. Orcs were so big and scary looking with their sharp teeth, green skin, and deep voices. She'd only caught the barest glimpses of them, but she had heard all the stories. But a baby wouldn't be big and scary. She glanced over at the small figure of her brother. Even as she watched, Farrelin stirred, opened his rosebud mouth, and announced that he was hungry with a shrill cry. In a smooth motion, Claudia rose, put down her sewing, picked up her son, bared a breast, and set him to nursing. "Taratha," she scolded, "you should be asleep." "I was," Taratha said, rising and running to her father. "I heard Dad come in." There's a lot of breastfeeding in this book. Which is okay. I'm not anti-breastfeeding or anything. Go ahead, knock yourself out. Temmus smiled tiredly and permitted Taratha to climb in his lap. "She won't go back to sleep until Farrelin is done," he told Claudia. Let me hold her for a while. I so seldom get to see her, and she's grown like a weed." He pinched her cheek gently, and she giggled. "If the orc dies, it will go badly with all of us here," he continued. Taratha frowned. The answer was obvious. "Da," she said. "If it's a baby, why are you trying to make it eat meat?" Both adults stared at her, stunned. "What do you mean, little one?" asked Tamith in a strained voice. Taratha pointed to her nursing mother. "Babies drink milk like Valin does. If this baby orc's mother is dead, it can't drink its milk." Tamis continued to stare, then a slow smile spread across his weary face. "Out of the mouths of babes," he whispered, and then hugged his daughter to him so tightly that she began to squirm in protest. "Tamis," Clenia's voice was taut. "My dearest," he said. He held Taratha with one arm and reached across the table to his wife with the other. "Tari's right. For all their barbaric ways, the orcs do nurse their young as we do. Our best guess is that the orc infant is but a few months old. It's no wonder it can't eat meat yet. It doesn't even have any teeth yet." He hesitated, but Clenia's face grew pale as if she knew what he was going to say. You can't ask me to." "Think what it will mean to our family," Tamis exclaimed. "I've served Blackmore for 10 years. I've never seen him this excited about anything. If that orc survives because of us, we will lack for nothing." I can't," stammered Clenia. "Can what?" asked Taratha, but they both ignored her. "Please," begged Tamis. "It's only for a little while." "They're monsters, Tan!" cried Clenia. "Monsters! And you want me to—" She covered her face with one hand and began to sob. The baby continued to nurse, unperturbed. "Dad, why is Mom crying?" asked Taratha, anxious. "I'm not crying," said Clenia thickly. She wiped her wet face and forced a smile. "You see, darling, all is well." She looked at Tamis and swallowed hard. "Your dad just has something he needs me to do. That's all." When Blackmore heard that his personal servant's wife had agreed to wet nurse the dying orc baby, the Foxton family was deluged with gifts. Rich fabrics, the freshest fruits and choicest meats, fine beeswax tapers, all began to appear regularly at the door of the small room that the family called their home. Soon that room was exchanged for another, and then for larger quarters still. Tamis Foxton was given his own horse, a lovely bay he named Ladyfire. Clenia, now called Mistress Foxton, no longer had to report to the kitchens, but spent all her time with her children, and tending to the needs of what Blackmore called his special project. Taratha wore fine clothes and even had a tutor, a fussy kind man named Jeremy Skisson, sent to teach her to read and write like a lady. But she was never allowed to speak about the small creature that lived with them for the next full year, who, when Farrellin died of a fever, became the only baby in the Foxton household, and when Thrall had learned to eat a vile concoction of blood, cow's milk, and porridge with his own small hands, 3 armed guards came and wrested him away from Taratha's arms. She cried and protested and received a harsh blow for her pleas. Her father held her and shushed her, kissing her pale cheek where the red hand imprint was visible. She quieted after a while, and like the obedient child she wished to appear, agreed never to speak of Thrall again, except in the most casual of terms. But she vowed she would never forget this strange creature that had been almost like a younger brother to her. Never. Well, and that brings home a lot more why in the Old Hillsbed Foothills dungeon and in the lore itself, like why Taratha is so keen to help Thrall and why he cares so much that she's killed later on. Spoiler alert for those of you that haven't played the game. No, like this. Jeremy Skisson stepped beside his pupil. Hold it thus with your fingers here. And here. Oh, that's better. Now make this motion like a snake. What is a snake? Asked Thrall. He was only 6 years old, but already almost as big as his tutor. His large, clumsy hands did not hold the delicate, thin stylus easily, and the clay tablet kept slipping out of his grasp. But he was stubborn and determined to master this letter that Jeremy called an S. Jeremy blinked behind his large spectacles. Oh, of course, he said more to himself than Thrall. A snake is a reptile with no feet. It looks like this letter. Thrall brightened with recognition. Like a worm, he said. He had often snacked on those small treats that found their way into his cell. Yes, it does resemble a worm. Try it again on your own this time. Thrall stuck his tongue out to aid his concentration. A shaky form appeared on the clay, but he knew it was recognizable as an S. Proud of himself, he extended it to Jeremy. Very good, Thrall. I think it may be time we started teaching you numbers, said the tutor. But first, it's time to start learning how to fight, Thrall? Thrall looked up to see the lean form of his master, Lieutenant Blackmore, standing in the doorway. He stepped inside. Thrall heard the lock click shut on the other side of the door. He had never tried to flee, but the guards always seemed to expect him to. At once, Thrall prostrated himself as Blackmore had taught him. A kindly pat on his head told him he had permission to rise. He stumbled to his feet, suddenly feeling even bigger and clumsier than usual. He looked down at Blackmore's boots, awaiting whatever it was his master had in store for him. "How is he coming in his lessons?" Blackmore asked Jeremy as if Thrall weren't present. "Very well. I hadn't realized orcs were quite so intelligent, but—" "He is intelligent not because he is an orc," Blackmore interrupted, his voice sharp enough to make Thrall flinch. "He is intelligent because humans taught him. Never forget that, Jarman. And you," the boots turned in Thrall's direction, "you aren't to forget that either." Thrall shook his head violently. "Look at me, Thrall." Thrall hesitated, then lifted his blue-eyed gaze. Blackmore's eyes bored into his own. "Do you know what your name means?" "No, sir." The voice sounded so rough and deep even in his own ears, next to the musical lilt of the humans' voices. "It means slave. It means that you belong to me." Blackmore stepped forward and prodded the orc's chest with a stiff forefinger. "It means that I own you. You understand that?" For a moment Thrall was so shocked he didn't reply. His name meant slave? It sounded so pleasant when humans spoke it. He thought it must be a good name, a worthy name. Blackmore's gloved hand came up and slapped Thrall across the face. Although the lieutenant had swung his hand with vigor, Thrall's skin was so thick and tough that the orc barely felt it, and yet the blow pained him deeply. His master had struck him. One large hand came up to touch the cheek, its black fingernails clipped short. "You answer when you're spoken to," snapped Blackmore. "Do you understand what I just said?" "Yes, Master Blackmore," replied Thrall, his deep voice barely a whisper. "Excellent." Blackmore's angry face relaxed into an approving smile. His teeth showed white against the surrounding black hair of his goatee. That quickly all was well again. Relief surged through Thrall. His lips turned up in his best approximation of Blackmore's smile. "Don't do that, Thrall," said Blackmore. "Makes you look uglier than you already are." Abruptly the smile vanished. "Lieutenant," said Jarman softly, "he's just trying to mimic your smile, that's all." "Well, he shouldn't. Humans smile. Orcs don't. You said he was doing well in his lessons, yes? Can he read and write, then?" "He is reading at quite an advanced level. As for writing, he understands how, but those thick fingers are having a difficult time with some of the lettering." "Excellent," Blackmore said again. "And we have no more need of your services." Thrall inhaled swiftly and looked over at Jarman. The older man appeared to be as surprised as he by the statement. "There is much he doesn't know yet, sir," stammered Jarman. "He knows little of numbers, or of history, of art." "He doesn't need to master history, and I can teach him what he needs to know about numbers myself. What does a slave need to know of art? I fancy you think that will be a waste of time, Thrall?" Thrall thought briefly of the one time Jarman had brought in a small statue and told him how it was carved, of how they had discussed how his swaddling cloth with its once bright colors of blue and white had been woven. That, Jarman had said, was art, and Thrall had been eager to learn more about making such beautiful things. "As my master wishes, so does Thrall," he said obediently, giving the lie to the feelings in his heart. "That's right. You don't need to know those things, Thrall. You need to learn how to fight." With uncharacteristic affection, Blackmore reached out a hand and placed it on Thrall's enormous shoulder. Thrall flinched and stared at his master. "I wanted you to learn reading and writing because it might one day give you an advantage over your opponent. I'm going to see to it that you are skilled with every weapon I have ever seen. I'm going to teach you about strategy, Thrall, and trickery. You're going to be famous in the gladiator ring. Thousands will chant your name when you appear. How's that sound, eh?" Thrall saw Jarman turn and gather up his things. It pained him strangely to see the stylus and the clay tablet disappear for the last time into Jarman's sack. With a quick backward glance, Jeremy moved to the door and knocked on it. It opened for him. He slipped out and the door was closed and locked. Blackmore was waiting for Thrall's response. Thrall was a fast learner and did not wish to be struck again for hesitating in his answer. Forcing himself to sound as if he believed it, he told his master, "That sounds exciting. I'm glad my master wishes me to follow this path." For the first time he could remember, Thrall the Orc stepped out of his cell. He gazed in wonder as, with 2 guards in front of him, 2 guards behind, and Blackmore keeping pace, he went through several winding stone corridors. They went up a set of stairs, then across, then down a winding stair that was so small it seemed to press in on Thrall. Ahead was a brightness that made Thrall blink. They were approaching that brightness, and the fear of the unknown set in. When the guards ahead of him went through and into this area, Thrall froze. The ground ahead was yellow and brown, not the familiar gray of stone. Black things that resembled the guards lay on the ground, following their every movement. "What are you doing?" snapped Blackmore. "Come out! Others held here will give their right arms to be able to walk out into the sunlight." Thrall knew the word. Sunlight was what came through in small slats in his cell, but there was so much sunlight out there. And what are the strange black things? What were they? Thrall pointed at the human-shaped things on the ground. To his shame, all the guards started laughing. One of them was soon wiping tears of mirth from his face. Blackmore turned red. "You idiot," he said. "Those are just... What the lot have I got myself an orc who's afraid of his own shadow?" He gestured, and one of the guards pricked Thrall's back deeply with the point of his spear. Although his naturally thick skin protected him, the prod stung, and Thrall lurched forward. His eyes burned, and he lifted his hands to cover them, and yet the sudden warmth of the sunlight on his head and back felt good. Slowly he lowered his hands and blinked, letting his eyes become accustomed to the light. Something huge and green loomed in front of him. Instinctively, he drew himself up to his full height and roared at it. More laughter from the guards, but this time Blackmore nodded in approval at Thrall's reaction. "That's a mock fighter," he said. "It's only made of burlap and stuffing and paint, Thrall. It's a troll." Again, embarrassment flamed through Thrall. Now that he looked more closely, he could tell it was no living thing. Straw served the mock fighter for hair, and he could see where it was stitched together. "Does a troll really look like that?" he asked. Blackmore chuckled. "Only vaguely," said Blackmore. "Wasn't designed for realism, but for practice. Watch." He extended a gloved arm, and one of the guards handed him something. "This is a wooden sword," Blackmore explained. "A sword is a weapon, and I use wood for practice. Once you're sufficiently trained with this, you'll move on to the real thing." Blackmore held the sword in both hands. He centered himself, then raced at the practice troll. He managed to strike it 3 times, once in the head, once in the body, and once along the false arm that held a cloth weapon, without breaking stride. Breathing only slightly heavily, he turned around and trotted back. "And now you try," he said. Thrall held out his hand for the weapon. His thick fingers closed around it. It fit his palm much better than the stylus had. It felt better, too, almost familiar. He adjusted the grip, trying to do what he had seen Blackmore do. "Very good," said Blackmore to one of his guards, who said, "Look at that, will ya? He's a natural, as I knew he would be. Now, Thrall, attack!" Thrall whirled. For the first time in his life, his body seemed willing to do what he asked of it. He lifted the sword, and to his surprise, a roar burst forth from his throat. His legs began to pump almost of their own accord, smoothly and swiftly carrying him toward the mock troll. He lifted the sword, it was so easy, and brought it down in a smooth arc across the troll's body. There was a terrible crack, and the troll went sailing through the air. Suddenly afraid he had done something terribly wrong, Thrall's grace turned to clumsiness, and he stumbled over his own feet. He hit the earth hard and felt the wooden sword crack underneath him. Thrall scrambled to his feet and prostrated himself, sure that some sort of terrible punishment was about to ensue. He had broken the mock troll and destroyed the practice sword. He was so big, so clumsy. Loud whoops filled the air. Other than Jeremy, the silent guards, and the occasional visit from Blackmore, Thrall had not had much interaction with humans. Certainly he had not learned to discern the finer points in their wordless noises, but he had a strange suspicion that these were not sounds of anger. Cautiously he looked up. Blackmore had an enormous smile on his face, as did the guards. One of them was bringing the palms of his hands together to create a loud smacking sound. When he caught sight of Thrall, Blackmore's smile widened even more. Did I not say he would surpass all expectations? Cried Blackmore. Well done, Thrall, well done. Thrall blinked, uncertain. That wasn't wrong? He asked. The troll and the sword. I broke them. Damn right you did. First time ever swinging a sword in the troll's sails across the courtyard. Blackmore's giddiness subsided slightly and he put his arm around the young orc in a friendly manner. Thrall tensed, then relaxed. Suppose you were in the gladiator ring, Blackmore said. Suppose that troll was real, that your sword was real, and suppose the first time you charged, you struck him so hard he fell that far. Don't you see that's a good thing, Thrall? The orc supposed he did. His large lips wanted to stretch over his teeth in a smile, but he resisted the impulse. Blackmore had never been so pleased with him, so kind to him before, and he wished to do nothing to disturb the moment. Blackmore squeezed Thrall's shoulder, then returned to his men. You, he shouted to a guard, get that troll back on the pike and make sure it's secure enough to withstand my Thrall's mighty blows. You get me another practice, or hell, give me 5 of them. Thrall's liable to break them all. Out of the corner of his eye, Thrall saw movement. He turned to see a tall, slender man with curly hair, dressed in livery, red, black, and gold, that marked him as one of Blackmore's servants. With him was a very small human being with bright yellow hair. It looked nothing like the guards that Thrall knew. He wondered if this was a human child. It looked softer, and its garments were not the trousers and tunics the others wore, but a long, flowing garment that brushed the dusty earth. Was this, then, a female child? His eyes locked with the blue ones of the child. She did not seem frightened of his ugly appearance at all. On the contrary, she met his gaze evenly, and as he watched, she smiled brightly and waved at him as if she was happy to see him. How could such a thing be? Even as Thrall watched, trying to determine the proper response, the male accompanying her clamped a hand to the little female's shoulder and steered her away. Wondering what had just happened, Thrall turned back to the cheering men and closed his large green hand about another practice sword. Alright, so, we're seeing Thrall being raised in this environment and how he's... they've done I feel like the author's doing a pretty decent job of just trying to impart that feeling of like what psychological stunting would occur to be completely just kept in a cage your whole life. And that's the kind of thing that psychological cases or case studies are based on in the real world now. And he's essentially like, it's lucky he turned out to be like, it's good he turned out to be such a hero. It's crazy because he should be like completely screwed up in the head. All right, we got another episode in the pipe, 5x5. We passed about 6 years forward. Thanks everyone so much for watching and listening, and I look forward to seeing you next time on Lore of Warcraft.